little bit about this last week, but the disciples were not, they were not the best of the best. They were like us. Sorry to offend us. None of us are the best of the best. We're just people, right? Everyone in here has different skills. We all have different faults and failures and shortcomings, and then we have things that we do really well. We all are that. We're just people. But the disciples, that's who they were. In fact, their society had basically labeled them as not all that special. So you just have to do all the basic stuff. Go catch the fish, collect the taxes, things like that. They're just normal people like us. And so how were this group of normal people, how are we talking about them 2,000 years later? Were they that smart and that brilliant? And the answer was no, because if they would have been smart or brilliant, they wouldn't have tried to start a faith on a resurrection claim, because that doesn't make sense. That especially whenever you're basing it in history, right? So if they claimed that Jesus was alive, then there were people there that could verify that. Right? That's not a good way to get your religion going. It's much easier to say, you know what? I had a vision in a cave and I was given all of this stuff. And then you just are really sincere about it. And you go, and the people who kind of like you already go, that kind of makes sense. He's a pretty good guy. He's probably not lying about that. But there would be no way to verify it. That's a good way to start a religion. Right? The disciples, they didn't do that. They actually said, no, he's not there anymore. We saw him. And it could be verified. Right? It changed everything about them. They went from hiding, they went from being scared for their life, to all being willing to die. And they were martyred for their faith. It's one thing to be martyred for your faith, for something that you believe in. It's different to be martyred for something that you know is a lie. There's not many people who are going to do that, right? And so the disciples, the reason they came up with the resurrection is because it happened, right? That's the only logical conclusion. But the disciples, they were still just normal people, and it's like, well, what do we do with this? Right? Like, what now? Yeah, this is amazing, but now where do we go? Right? And thankfully, Jesus doesn't leave them hanging. Right? But I want to look at two of the disciples and two responses, because again, we need to be preparing ourselves to live out our faith. This is something that we should be doing all the time, but I do believe it's going to be more challenging as we move forward because of what's going on in our world. So to me, we can learn a lot from the disciples, because they're taking a crazy message to a world that is going to end up getting them killed. Right? They needed to be pretty prepared to endure that. And one of the greatest tools of the enemy is fear. And fear can come in lots of different ways, and it can start from lots of different places. A lot of times it doesn't actually start with fear, being scared of something. It starts with other things that then leads you to be fearful of actually living out your faith. Right? And two of the greatest tools of the enemy, I believe, are doubt and guilt. Right? If the enemy can get to where you're constantly doubting, then you're going to be fearful to really stand up for what you believe, because you're always doubting. Right? If the enemy can get you to be so overcome with guilt that you do not see yourself as worthy, right? That you're never good enough, then you're never going to step up and actually proclaim your faith, because you're always going to be, well, they probably know that I'm not good enough, that I've made mistakes. Yes, that's right. But Christ overcomes that. But the enemy can use those two things in very powerful ways that lead to us being fearful of actually living out our faith. And I believe that's why John records two interactions that Thomas has and that Peter has with Jesus. I think they specifically deal with those two emotions. And of course, the first is doubt. And good old Thomas, you have to love Thomas the disciple. Poor guy. 2,000 years later, the way that we think of Thomas is doubting Thomas, right? He's labeled as doubting Thomas. And how ridiculous is that? We mock someone for doubting that someone rose from the dead, right? Like, yeah, you should doubt that, right? If anyone comes up and tells you, hey, I just saw great grandma Nellie, you should probably question that. Doubt that, right? She's been in the grave a while, right? So it's normal to doubt. Thomas has been doubting Thomas. We don't remember the fact that whenever Lazarus rose again and there was lots of tension and Jesus was saying, okay, now it's time to go into Jerusalem. And they literally thought they're going to kill him. Like there was something was going on right there. It was Thomas said, well, let's go so we can die. Right? Like, I mean, Thomas was all in with Jesus. He did not doubt that Jesus was the Messiah, that he was the Christ. He just was like anyone, didn't think that the cross was going to be involved. Right? So he happens to not be there with the disciples. And I've heard lots of sermons preached on Thomas, and we can learn a lot. But I've even heard some that are kind of criticizing Thomas so that we don't make the same mistakes, right? That he should have been with the group the first time, but he wasn't where he was supposed to be. He should have been with the group the week before, and he would have seen Jesus, but he wasn't there. Well, we have no idea why he wasn't there. He may have been getting the pizza that night. And then Jesus shows up and he comes back. I've got the pizzas, here they are. And everybody's like, we don't care about the pizzas. Jesus just showed up. And Tom's like, I knew I didn't want to go get the pizzas tonight. Right? Like, so we have no idea why Thomas wasn't there. It doesn't matter why Thomas wasn't there, because he was there for the second time. By the way, after the disciples had told him, hey, we saw Jesus. Now, he doubted that, but he showed up because he wanted to find out, right? He didn't let his doubt stop him from seeking the truth, right? That is what the enemy wants to do, is the enemy wants us to have doubt and then stop seeking for the truth. No, don't even give this God guy a chance, right? Because we know, we have the scientific evidence now. We don't have to rely on God. Don't even start looking. Why would you start looking, right? Doubt is a powerful thing. In John chapter 20, verse 24, now we know that Jesus has already appeared to the other disciples. John chapter 20, verse 24. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, which is twin, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my fingers where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. And Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. Then Jesus told him, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Just a cool scene. I mean, just imagine you're in there and you're Thomas and Jesus shows up and you're like, ooh, I was wrong, and like, was he having to like pay people off? Like, were there side bets, and so he's like, well, here you go, Peter, here's a couple shekels, I don't know. Can you just imagine? What I truly believe and I feel is that Thomas wants this to be true, right? He is showing up. He wants it to be true, but he needs to know for sure because this doesn't make sense. I think Thomas understood what this truly meant. That if this is true, life is forever changed. And you know what? You shouldn't change your life on something that you don't know whether is true or not. I think Thomas knew everything that I once knew to be true is now turned upside down in light of what has just happened. And my life is going to be completely different. It's one thing to start, sharing the continuation of the Jewish faith of the Messiah, that the Messiah has come and that it's Jesus. And so you haven't really created a new religion. You're just continuing the Old Testament message of the Messiah will be coming. That's what they thought they were going to do. They didn't think they were starting a new faith, a new religion. But if this was true, if Jesus Christ truly rose from the dead, Thomas knew everything. That's a lot harder message to convey. He wants to know that it is true. And so, of course, he says, I want to be able to feel the marks in your hands and in your side. It's interesting that there's no indication that he actually did that. Jesus offers, but we don't know. We don't know. I think Thomas was just, nope, my Lord and my God. I've seen it. I believe it. Let's go, right? But he was offered that. And then I love Jesus' response, because you have seen, you have believed, but blessed are those who have not seen, but yet have believed. That should give all of us hope. What Jesus is saying here is that you can believe even though you haven't seen, right? That your faith is valid. That can happen, right? That's a powerful thing. So never doubt that, right? The world tries to get us to doubt that. And we'll say, how can you believe that? Give me examples. Give me evidence. All this stuff. And you can come up with certain things, but at the end, you have to admit, I can't prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. Thomas wouldn't say that. He knew. We're a little bit different. Our faith ultimately, our belief is ultimately based on faith, right? And so you can't completely prove that. But don't let the enemy just overcome you with doubt of that. It's okay to question. This is not saying that we should never doubt. No, God's big enough to handle your doubt, right? But he wants you to bring it to him, right? To be brave enough to actually come to him to seek the truth. The enemy wants to use that doubt to put a wedge between you and God so that you never even approach him. And another thing that kind of jumped out to me in this passage that I hadn't really thought about before is when Jesus is offering the hands and the side, and Thomas says that, Thomas is, in a very real sense, he is seeing the cost of choosing to believe and choosing to follow Jesus. He knows now what this may lead to. That the cost is steep. It's worth it. But don't think that we have a faith that demands nothing, a faith that's just going to make your life roses. No. We have a faith that actually is sometimes it's going to test you. Sometimes it's going to make life more difficult. Sometimes it leads to a cross. Sometimes Jesus' words of take up your cross and follow me are very literal. That our faith leads to suffering at times. suffering for him. And man, if you doubt, you're going to turn away at the first sign of suffering. We live in a society that is designed where we don't have to suffer in any way, shape, or form, right? It doesn't work, but that's what our society is trying to do. And the reality of living in a fallen world, it doesn't matter how far technology advances, we will have difficulty. We will have suffering. So you need to know, what are you suffering for? Is what you're suffering for worth it? Is it true? And when Thomas is feeling the hands and the side and seeing that from Jesus, he knows. He knows what this may lead. And in fact, the tradition is that he was killed in India in a very brutal way because he was sharing this message that he knew to be true. He was willing to join in the suffering of Christ as well. Doubt will keep you from doing that. Don't allow doubt to keep you from entering into that life-changing relationship with Christ. Thomas didn't, and his life was changed. Doubt is a big one. Guilt, I think, is just as powerful. Guilt for what we've done in the past. Guilt for our doubt. Feeling guilty for not living up to what we know is right. That can be a motivation at times, but then it can easily turn the other way, where we just say, you know what, we can't live up to that standard. And by the way, guilt, why it's such a motive or a wonderful tool for the enemy, is because the standard that this sets is very high, and none of us are going to meet it. So if you are overcome with guilt all the time, then you're just going to quit because it's too hard to live up to all of this. Right? But that is not the desire. That's not what it is supposed to do. It is showing us the best way to live. It's showing the way that God desires for us to live, that He created us to live. But because we live in this fallen world, we don't live up to it. And if we're going to allow guilt to consume us, pretty soon we're just going to get rid of this. So, you know what? It's just not worth it. And so Jesus knows that. And He has an encounter with Peter, who, of course, Peter is known as the rock. He became the father, if you will, of the earthly church. Peter was amazing. But there was something that I believe Jesus knew could trip Peter up if it wasn't resolved and if Peter allowed to eat at him. And so Jesus had an amazing encounter. I want to read starting in chapter 21 of John. So this is again after they've seen Jesus at least twice. Life is kind of continuing to go on. They're still not sure exactly what this means. And so chapter 21 said, afterward, Jesus appeared again to the disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them, and they said, we'll go with you. So they went out, got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved, that's how John refers to himself. Hey, if you're the author, you can refer to yourself however, right? And it's not untrue. He did love John. He also loved the other ones. But then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat, dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself, went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said, "Follow me." Now, I mean, there's just how cool. And I love that it puts in there were 153 fish. Well, how would they have known that? Because that really happened, and they counted the fish because they were amazed at how many it was, right? And then, you can read things, and there's all kinds of theories of why it was 153. It's just a lot of fish, right? And it was a cool miracle, and it was again there was a connection between that because Jesus had done that stuff before, so they're being confirmed. Hey, this is the same guy that we've known for the last 3 years, but there's also something else a little different, right? So that he's the same guy, same power, but now he's overcome the grave. Right? And so it's just confirming, okay, yes, you were right. I am the Messiah, but you were wrong. I am much more powerful than you could have ever imagined. Right? So it's confirming all of that. And so the disciples are there, and Simon Peter, of course, he's the impulsive one. He's the emotional one. He's so excited about what's going on. And so he gets out, and I'm sure all the other disciples were saying, "Yeah, now that we have a full net, Simon leaves, and we have to haul this in ourselves." But Simon is so excited, and he gets there, and he begins. They eat together, and then Jesus you can just feel the mood change, right? Who knows what they've been talking about? They were just talking, no telling, right? But then Jesus looks and he makes eye contact with Simon. And he says, "Simon, do you love me?" Right? And that's a simple question. It's kind of a weird question. It's one you hope you know the answer to, right? You don't want to leave that out there hanging, right? And so Simon, it fits the moment, right? This is an exciting time. And so Peter, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Feed my sheep." And then he looks at him again, "Do you love me?" And Simon's like, "What? Maybe you didn't hear me the first time." Yes, Lord, I do love you. Will feed my lambs. Right? And then he asks again. And you can imagine that Peter is kind of like, "Oh, why a third time? Like, why a third time?" But he's going to answer. Right? You don't get the feeling he was considering not answering, but he's like, "What are you doubting me? Are you doubting that I love you? Right? Am I having to convince you?" Right? And then, of course, Jesus says, "Go and feed my sheep." See, I think something very important was happening in this exchange. Because more than likely, well, not more than likely, we know for sure that Peter has already wept because he has denied knowing Jesus. And he denied knowing Jesus 3 specific times. Now, I don't know about you, but that I would feel a lot of guilt from doing that. And you know how guilt works is all of a sudden, you may wake up tomorrow morning and have that weird feeling of guilt for something that you did when you were in high school. And you're like, what? Why did I even think of that? What is that? Right? Guilt is weird. And it can stick with you. But something that big, when Jesus needed you most, right? When he was at his worst, he is now being prepared to be crucified. And everybody else is turned on him. And you had a chance just to stand up and say, yeah, this is unfair. I know that guy. That's all you had to do. And he failed to do it. That's a guilt that sticks with you. And I think Jesus knew that the enemy would try to use that kind of guilt to convince Peter, you're not good enough. You failed him before. Remember that night? 3 times you failed him. So you just need to back up. That was going to be a strong tool that Satan could use. And Jesus wanted Peter to know, I forgive you every time. And it is gone. You are the person that I am calling you to be. I know about your past, and I don't care about that past anymore because you love me, you have repented, you have asked for forgiveness, you desire to move forward, and I'm moving forward with you. Don't go back to who you were. That is what Jesus was saying to Peter. That's what he's saying to us. There's some good things about guilt. You should feel bad and you should feel that guilt when you go against God. It should be something that alerts you that, wait, is what I'm doing godly? And if when you make those decisions and you do things that you shouldn't do, you should feel some guilt. And that should drive you into the arms of a forgiving and loving Christ, not away from him. Satan wants it to be used to drive you away from him. He will use that guilt to say, you're not good enough. You're not worth it. Guess what? You're right. He's right. You're not. But Christ died for you anyway. And he has forgiven you. And he doesn't want that guilt to stand in the way. When you're struggling with your faith, with standing up for your faith, with living out your faith, don't let doubt and guilt cause you to fear. Don't let it shut you up. Don't shrink from the battle because of doubt and guilt. Bring those things to Christ. Let him overcome your doubt. Let him remind you that, yes, you're guilty, but your sin is paid in full and is no longer considered in the equation. You are now free to live a new life. Do not allow the enemy to use those weapons to keep you from living the life that Christ has called you to live. Let's go to him in prayer.